Good morning, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. Let me know if there's any issues with this video, if there's something that you can't access or something that you can't hear, and just ignore any noise that's in the background. I have a family that's getting ready for a wedding, but in any case, the topic that I'm going to do this video on, I'm going to try to keep it really short for you. We're talking about political, economic, and social systems, and the various societies that we meet in world history oftentimes will have components that are political, components that are economic, and components that are social. Of course, other things will matter too, but these are common ways to examine different societies and groups of people. And political, economic, and social systems tend to relate very much to the cultural values, right? So a society like the United States, where we might identify individual rights as a very significant value, and there may be debate about how much individual rights should exist versus, responsibility to society or something else. But we can kind of accept that that's probably something that's embedded in founding documents in the US and maybe a lot of our laws and a great deal of our economic fabric, a lot of the ways in which we create institutions and parts of our society really relate to that cultural value of individual rights. Other societies may have different cultural values and may have different sets of laws for their political system, may have different sets of ways that they organize their economic system. So just kind of have right now an idea that political, economic, and social systems really connect very much to the cultural values, okay? The first one that we'll look at is political system, and we're going to keep this kind of broad at first. As we go through the year, we'll get a little bit more specific. The basic rule of thumb with any type of political system, and there are many different kinds of political systems, and then you can get very specific with describing society's political systems. How does the society actually make decisions? Every society reaches a point where there must be some decisions made. How will the society go about a crisis? For example, the society in Libya. And this comes down to a very basic question, who rules? Who will be making these decisions? In many of the societies we look at in world history, we're going to be seeing one-person rulers, right? Perhaps somebody who has maybe, hereditary power through a royal family or emperor status. There also might be a group of people who rule. So there's a variety of different kinds of political systems, but all of the institutions and all of the documents, all of the connections to that question of who rules, who makes decisions, how does that happen, in some cases very formally and in some cases very informally, that's going to be related to the political system, okay? One thing to share is just some basic ideas of political system. If we look at who rules, we can kind of start with some very, basic things, right? So if nobody is ruling, we call that anarchy, right? Kind of like a Lord of the Flies. If you were in a classroom, and the teacher, left, there would be this question of, what now? What? Who's going to decide? Do we have a quiz today? Do we do our homework? Whatever it might be, you might see some anarchy, right? Nobody's ruling, and so there's no political system. You might also have a rule of one, and we can put these to start in a broad way under two general categories, okay? One might be a monarchy where there is one ruler, right? So mon kind of giving us the idea that this is one ruler, and some type of dictatorship, okay? Whether it's like a totalitarian regime, kind of a total control, but dictatorship might be different than a monarchy in one particular way. A monarch oftentimes has political power through a hereditary family line. That may be an absolute monarch who has full control, and the entire, political system is basically in the hands of the monarch. There could also be a constitutional monarchy, which basically includes a document that outlines a little bit of the limitations of the power on a particular monarch. So there are some societies today that have a monarch and a royal family, but don't necessarily have full constitutional power for that individual to rule and make decisions. Okay, so sometimes monarch's power can be very limited by a constitution. It is not uncommon for there to be monarchs today. There are several societies that have those. It is less common than it was in the time period that we're going to be looking at, where monarchs of some type were very, very common. Dictatorships are when people are assuming power and not necessarily in a position of being, part of a hereditary family line. And there are multiple kinds of ways that dictators may rule. That's something we can spend a little bit more time with in class. There's the rule of a few, and this would be described as an oligarchy. It is different than a monarchy because now we're talking about a group of people sharing power. An oligarchy is something that is maybe it could happen in a variety of different ways. A society could have a military uprising where military maybe take control, for example, of a society that was once a monarchy, and a military junta of sorts might control the government, might actually be in control and be an authority, and may have a group of people calling the shots, so to speak. An oligarchy can be temporary in a society, can also be long-lasting. You could also have an oligarchy in the form of some type of political party. You might have, for example, a communist party that is existing in an oligarchy form. In some cases, some members of the oligarchy may have more power than others, but you have a group of people who are essentially making decisions on a central level for a group of people. You can have a variety of other kinds of oligarchies too. There are some critics of U.S. Political systems who suggest that the United States has largely become an oligarchy of corporate elites. So corporations that might have a great deal of informal power can also, kind of informally act as an oligarchy of sorts. So it's, not necessarily something that people debate about to what degree a society might be an oligarchy. The key definition is that it's really ruled by a few people. And of course, there's a democracy, which we can recognize a little bit in our more modern times. It comes as a model to us from ancient times. It's not a model that we see consistently throughout the time period we're going to be looking at in world history. A lot of the societies we look at are not democracies. Oftentimes we describe the United States currently as democratic. Again, there's debate over to what extent, but definition of democracy, there are two kinds of democracy. We could look at democracy as some degree of rule by the people. So, having all citizens in a democracy have some connection to the question of who rules. In a direct democracy, which is, feasibly very difficult in a society that's large like the United States, the idea would be to put, everybody in a space where every person in the democracy has the ability to answer questions or vote about particular questions in the democracy, maybe decisions that need to be made. The United States is not a direct democracy. We don't get phone calls every night from our Congress asking us what we think. Our democracy is not direct. Plato described a direct democracy as, putting people on a hill and basically asking them questions and getting answers by, vote. Most societies today that are representative, that are democracies, we're talking about representative democracies, sometimes described as a republic. When you say the Pledge of Allegiance, to the republic, for which it stands, we're describing the representative democracy. This is where there are elected officials at various levels of government who then make decisions on our behalf. We elect them to serve in our place. Okay, so there is some degree that we have power over our elected officials because we vote them into office and we can ultimately vote them out of office. There are tools to do that, such as impeachment, for example, and then which may or may not lead to conviction. There's also other tools as well at the state level and whatnot. So there is some public oversight, and we have the ability to communicate with our elected officials. There's also a political system that would be described as a theocracy. This might be the Puritans in New England in the 1600s. They would be a theocracy. In order to be a member of the society, you basically had to be a member of the Puritan church, and the political system was connected to membership in the church and the rules that the religion of Protestantism was dictating, the Puritan version of Protestantism. In today's day and age, we could probably describe modern day Afghanistan, which is ruled by the Taliban, and is a kind of fundamentalist Islamic state. Some of that could also be described as a theocracy. So a theocracy does not necessarily have to be limited to a monarchy. It could also be an oligarchy. It could also, to some degree, be a democracy. But for the most part, we tend to see monarchies and oligarchies become theocracies, where religion is dictating the political rules. In terms of economic system, we're going to limit this to one slide. A society that has an economic system, and all societies do, big and small, answers a few questions. An economic system answers a few questions, okay? The first question is, what goods and services does a society produce? Okay, what are the goods and services that a society produces? The second thing is, how does the society produce them? Okay, how does the society produce them? What goods and services is the decision of, should the society be making goods that include, food for the society? Should it be goods that are going to be exported to other societies? What actually gets produced? How does all that production occur? That's also a decision that the economic system decides. So, in the United States, consumers largely decide what goods to produce. That might be, shoes that you want to buy, or notebooks, for your history class. Everything that consumers demand, businesses oftentimes are going to organize, to produce. In the case of like COVID vaccines, there was some government involvement into what to produce because there was a societal need. And so we saw, to some degree, the government, stepping up to make some of those decisions. How to produce the goods has to do with businesses and firms, and perhaps how they do it. Or in some societies, the government largely produces goods for society. So not all societies have the same economic system, but all societies answer the question, how should goods be produced? Which institutions do that, and how is that determined? How should goods be distributed? Who gets what? In the market system of capitalism in the United States, which is an economic system, goods are distributed based on prices and, supply and demand. Whoever can pay for the goods and demands the goods can largely get the goods. I might want to have a, brand new car, but if I don't have the means to do that, the good will not be distributed to me. We also, of course, have other goods in the United States that are not part of the market system using supply and demand, like public education. That might be a good that's distributed to all children across the United States because it is something that society has determined should not be, limited by price. Okay. That's an example of, making decisions, all of those decisions that are made over time of how particular goods and services will be distributed. That's what the economic system does. Okay. If resources are scarce, how do we know, who is going to get what? And we assume in any society, resources are scarce. There's not enough of everything. So there has to be an allocation system. That allocation system is what we're talking about. Okay. There's two types of economic systems. Today, we tend to see market systems. Okay. What we see in the United States as a market system known as capitalism. There are limitations on this. So the US technically has a mixed economic system. We have a market that dictates a great deal of the decision making in our economy, who gets what. It's dependent on consumers and producers. But of course, we also know the government plays a role in regulating that process. So we have a mixed market or mixed economy. There's also pure command-based economies. This would be something similar to a central government system, where basically the central government of a society might decide what gets produced in the society, sometimes even years in advance. This would be what we might see in Soviet Union in the 1950s, what you might see in a modern day communist country to some degree, maybe like Cuba, which still has some degree of a command-based system. People who are working as doctors or teachers or perhaps engineers are working and paid by the central government. People in those careers are paid the same and then are allocated goods by the central government. In many command societies, there's also an underground market based on supply and demand. That's something technically illegal, but not uncommon at all. Okay, we'll talk about economic systems further during the year, but for now, have an idea about what it is that is largely, when we think about economic systems, we're thinking about what are some of the issues that pertain to these questions and what is the system that organizes, the answer to this question. Okay. The next slide is one that's very short, and I'm going to stop it here. Social system is broad. Okay. When we are talking about a society's social system, think of the following things that are on this slide as examples, and we tend to ask a few different questions. One is about equality and equity. To what extent do different groups of people in the society participate in the society? Okay, that's a really key question with the social system. Sometimes there's a class system that's very specific and includes and excludes groups of people. That can be formal and informal. What are the priorities in the society? What is it that the society chooses to focus on? And how do the following things tend to play out in a society in terms of access, in terms of availability, and in terms of services? Education, gender issues, what there might be social norms about in terms of understanding the role of gender. And gender, of course, is different than biological sex, which might get assigned to somebody at birth. Gender is what we describe in conversations about people's identity to either a variety of gender, male, female, and so on. Many different discussions today about the variety and ways in which there's a spectrum of sorts in terms of gender. Class structure and class, the way that might fold out in a society. Ethnic and racial diversity. This is something that we talk about in modern day society in the United States. It's also something that we pay careful attention to in historical societies. Health, access to public health or health in general, and health care. Housing, of course, where people live, the way in which people live, who lives where, how gender, how other social norms might dictate where people live, issues of discrimination, inequality, ways that people are included or not included, of course, recreation, other types of aspects, philosophy and intellectual pursuits, there's a lot of influences on the social system. Okay, we'll talk about that more in class, but as you look at those articles about Libya, try to put your finger on what in the article and in this crisis is clearly political in nature, political issues, relates to the political system in Libya, what relates to the economic system, and what relates to the social system. Okay, have a good day, everybody.